So hi, this is Brad from Motionworks. Today we are on site at Porter's Corporation in Aoyama to talk about employer branding and how it affects both direct hire companies and also the recruitment industry. So my name is Brad Corbet and I'm Managing Director of Motionworks Media, Motionworks KK. And I'm originally from America, a place called St. Louis, Missouri. And I actually came to Japan. I tell most people it's about 20 years, but it's actually closer to 30 years. And originally I came over with the military. I was in the US Navy stationed in Yokosuka and Atsugi for about 7 years. And I kind of did the general thing. I got out and I was teaching English. And then I kind of ended up teaching and managing. And then I was a trainer. And I think when I was a trainer teaching English, I think that's where my HR career kind of started. And I kind of shifted into HR and training. And then I took the deep dive and joined a recruiting company at that time. So that's kind of how my career ended up in recruiting and where I am now. So Motionworks is an employer branding and recruitment solutions company. And ideally, I come from a very recruiting, traditional recruiting environment, and I kind of wanted to get away from that and more into the employer branding side when I started Motionworks. So ideally, the idea and the concept around Motionworks is really to help companies attract and retain talent through employer branding, as well as traditional recruiting approaches. And more often than not, what happens is they prefer the traditional recruiting methods and not so much employer branding, but that's starting to change now. So we work with both recruiting agencies and also direct hire companies for both regular recruiting as well as rec to rec, and also employer branding, corporate PR videos, podcasts, social media management, and strategic employer branding strategies. Painful and challenging, but fun. It's been an interesting journey, because when we started out pushing the employer branding, we basically went ignored for almost a year and a half. And then suddenly there was this uptick of interest in Japan from both the recruiting agency side and also direct hire company side to do employer branding. And I think even now to this point, employer branding is still a bit misunderstood about how companies can leverage this tool to engage talent here in Japan, in particularly here in Japan. Rec to rec is quite big in the UK. It's quite a mature market in the UK and in the US as well, and some places in Europe, but still quite immature market in Japan. So I think, a lot of the rec to rec needs are still increasing here in Japan for a lot of boutiques as well as some large shops. But it's been an interesting journey to work on the rec to rec side. I think in general, there's always going to be a need. Right now, for a long time in Japan, it's been a candidate-driven market. And companies are going to always need to rely on agencies to help fill key roles in organizations. So I do think as recruiting agencies grow, the need for rec to rec is definitely going to be on the increase. Already I've seen the number of actual rec to rec companies jump from just 2 to 4 or 5 now. So I definitely think the need is going to continue. I don't think the number of rec to rec agencies will grow necessarily, but I do think the need for experienced recruiters or very niche recruiters is going to increase. Going back to some of the common challenges I think that both direct hire companies and recruiting agencies face is that right now where we are, especially during COVID and everything, companies are still trying to play catch up. So I think employer branding has been put back even further. But I think thanks to COVID, I think COVID was kind of a catalyst to get companies to maybe think differently. So I do think that even while it's challenging to get companies to understand the power of branding and employer branding, I do see an uptick in companies that are starting to at least practice that and understand the need for employer branding. But in terms of challenges, yeah, that's the biggest thing is they expect a quick return on investment from doing some kind of branding. And that's not really what you should expect with branding. Branding it could happen quickly or it could happen very slowly, right? But there's no easy way to figure out when that's going to happen. But I think for us, we've definitely seen that it will happen, guaranteed. And I'll definitely put my money on that because we've seen that firsthand. But in terms of time and how long it's going to take to do it, that's the biggest challenge, I think, to convince also companies to see the advantages or the return of doing employer branding. I think obviously there's a misconception or a misunderstanding in terms of like what is marketing and what is branding. And for my definition or our definition, branding is, and again, when I say branding, I'm talking about a company's employer branding. It's really your story, your why, your culture, and telling people what you know, and then putting that out to a target audience, right? So the first part is branding, the second part is the marketing, right? So marketing is just the platform where you're gonna put that message out, right? So I think the easy definition of branding or employer branding is the stories around your culture, what your mission is, what your why is, and your experience and your strength. And then the marketing part is just putting that out into the right channels where your market is. So for me, that's maybe the easiest way or the best way to differentiate the two. We come across this a lot, right? And honestly, the short answer is everyone. Everyone should be in charge or responsible for branding when it comes to the company. And not one particular team or person within the company, to be honest. So for example, there is a gap between what a marketing team does and what like an HR or talent acquisition team does. But that doesn't mean that one team should have the responsibility or the burden to take on that whole thing. And honestly, in the best organizations that I've seen globally, when you reach the executive level or the CEO or the C-suite, and you can get entire buy-in from the executives down to the front line, that's when employer branding strategies work the best, is if the executive level and the executive team is involved with the employer branding, then it's a lot easier for teams and individuals to execute employer branding strategies. Yeah, again, kind of to restate from the previous answer, is I think you have to get buy-in. You have to get internal buy-in from everyone above and below your rank or whatever, the hierarchy in the company. And you really have to get their feedback of, is this going to work? But I would imagine that every company, I mean, even companies that have a lot of negative things, there must be at least one or two things that are good about that company. So not just all good companies can do employer branding. I think any company can do employer branding. So I think if a company feels that it's difficult to implement an employer branding strategy, have a talk internally with everyone from different departments, or even just do a simple questionnaire to find out if it's actually possible. And you might get interesting information back of other things that are good or bad in the company that you might need to focus on. And again, I mean, adding on to that, right? I mean, the worst case scenario is you get one person that says, okay, we're going to do employer branding, and no one else wants to do it in the company. Then it's almost a waste of time because you're already involved in the project. Maybe you've already spent money to develop things, and then no one wants to take part in it, right? So I do think you have to think, with the goal in mind and then work backwards, and starting with just pinging it around with your existing team to see if it's actually going to work, and see what areas you could highlight. Yeah, one of the other challenges that we face also is related to budgets. So a lot of times they're fine. They're happy to say, yep, we're going to do employer branding, but we don't know which team is going to pay for it. Right? Is it going to come from the marketing department? Is it going to come from operations? Is it going to come from... So that's one of the other challenges that we run into is where is this money going to come from? And again, I understand the easy answer is, it's all connected, right? But the bigger organizations, obviously their accounting is quite different. So yeah, you have to get approval of budgets and those kind of things. So yeah, those are some of the other challenges that we run into as well. I think in the recruitment industry, some of the companies that stand out that are doing a really good job with employer branding are Robert Half and Wall & Case and Cornerstone in particular. Why? Because they're using a lot of video, which is always good. And also they're highlighting the people in the organization and also what they do well as a company, their expertise in a particular industry. So I think those are just a few that stand out that are setting a good benchmark for employer branding. But I also see a lot of some of the other companies such as like JC Group, Randstad, Career Scout, and some other even boutique ones that are really starting to experiment with good content to reach either clients or candidates in the market. So there is a lot of good content coming from recruiting agencies, both small and large, here in Japan. On direct hire company side, recently I did see a really good, quite long video from PwC about their consulting journey. It was really good. It was about 7 minutes in length, and it showed, how they create a consultative team project within like a 2-week period. So I think this was done probably by Dentsu or some of the bigger agencies. But yeah, it was probably one of the first larger scale employer branding ones that really catered to potential clients that could work with them, but more like how they work as a consultative team. So I thought that was actually quite good on the direct hire side. But there are a lot of companies that are really, they have much bigger budgets to do some of these things in employer branding. So I think the larger companies are probably putting a lot more money into employer branding, whereas over on the recruiting industry side, they probably don't have as much money to put into those things. And that's honestly, that's where really our market is the small to medium-sized companies to kind of create that content and push that out. Honestly, it's really hard to know which platform your audience is going to be at or be on. So you almost have to put it out in every form. And that's where it gets really complicated because, for us, we found that LinkedIn has been a pretty good platform for us to use. However, we've also seen a huge uptick in podcasts. Yeah, so for example, for us, we decided to do podcasts from a very early stage. And I didn't have a lot of expectations on the engagement or the number of downloads for podcasts. But actually that turns out to be one of our strongest areas, is that because we're using video, we're using that audio, and there are people that prefer to listen to that instead of read it. So yeah, you just never know which platform is the best. So you almost have to create the content. And this is when it gets really complicated, especially for the marketing teams, is how you develop that content or this particular message for different platforms and different contents. So the short answer is you have to put it on all the platforms in order to find out which ones are going to work best for you. Yeah, so a lot of times we work with companies or existing clients or even potential clients, or just have casual talks with companies. And that's usually one of the questions we ask is like, that maybe they have content that they've put out, but they don't have any data on the engagement rates or the hit rates or anything like that. And that's really super important when you have an employer branding strategy, I think for any marketing strategy, is you really have to know where your data is coming from. So yeah, that's one of the key things that we really try to help companies with is how they measure the touch points. And it's quite difficult, right? Because you have to, companies really need to have some kind of tool like HubSpot or something like that that can manage or track all that kind of data. And, but in the simplest sense, like if you do come out with content or an employer branding strategy, I think the easiest way to gauge or measure whether it's being received is, for example, if somebody applies for a job and you go to the first interview and you just ask, hey, by the way, did you see any of our content? And you'd be amazed that maybe they did, or maybe they tell you that even without you asking, right? So I think that's the easiest way, is if you go to a client and you say, hey, by the way, have you seen any of our content that we put out? If the answer is yes, great, keep doing it. If the answer is no, it means that you need to keep making more. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've seen, which is a good thing, is that people are understanding the concept or the basic concept of employer branding, and that they probably need to have it sometime in the near future. So that's the good thing. And I think in general, people are aware of what it means now in terms of employer branding and what it can do. Much better than it was, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago. The current situation now is, we're, as I mentioned, I think the pandemic was kind of the catalyst for change. And I think the companies that were able to pivot for their own business, whatever it was, I think are now in a position to kind of get into employer branding and implement employer branding strategies. So that's what I see that as a good thing now. And I do see an uptick of companies experimenting with employer branding content and initiatives. So I think that's a good thing to see right now. Yeah, for future expectations, honestly, I think that, the candidate-driven market is not really going to change much. I think that, direct hire companies and recruiting agencies are going to be a lot more cohesive and working together more in a relationship more than just a contractual thing. And I actually think that the contingency model is going to slowly disappear, probably in the near future. And on top of that, I think companies are going to, advise with recruiting agencies on hiring strategies as well as employer branding strategies. So I think that's where the future of employer branding is going to, I think it's going to end up in recruiting companies taking the lead with employer branding for companies, or companies outsourcing to much bigger creative advertising agencies to implement their employer branding strategies. I think for those companies, honestly, like we don't really want to talk or engage with companies that aren't ready to do employer branding. It kind of goes back to the point of you can't push employer branding on someone that doesn't want to do it. They have to really holistically want to develop their employer brand to do that. So companies that aren't ready to do it, it's fine. Give them time. They'll do it. But I think if anything, companies that aren't considering any employer branding at least should sit down with a different group of people internally and say what is an ask, what is needed, to attract talent to the brand or to increase sales or whatever, right? And I think you can do that with a good employer branding initiative. But, again, we try to practice what we preach. We've been in business almost 4.5 years now, and we've done no cold calling, no promotional ads or anything like that. Everything that we've gotten from recruiting jobs to employer branding jobs and video projects and interviews has all been by word of mouth or the content that we've created. So that's really been our style and our kind of strategy. And that's what we want to help companies also do as well. So if they're in that situation, it's really hard to convince somebody if they're not really ready to get to that point yet. However, I do see some companies that are getting a small interest in that. Like sometimes I'll get people coming to me and say, hey, how much does it cost to make one video? Or, hey, our competitor did something like this. Could you do something like that? So those questions are good. That's the first sign that there's an interest or some kind of motivation to do that. And those are both super questions to answer. And again, our answer is the same, like go back. You have to have a whole strategy. You know, to make one video, it's really no point. If you're only going to do it once, that's hard to make a strategy out of one type of content. So it's really a holistic approach that you have to do. But those are good questions to ask initially. Yeah, I think, so we have kind of a slide deck of how companies can do that. But the first one is really, if you're the person responsible for thinking about the strategy, I think that's the hardest place to start, is really go somewhere and think by yourself of what you really need. Just grab a pen and a piece of paper and say, like, what could we do? I think that's the hardest thing to do. But on top of that, yeah, there's like 6 or 7 stages that you actually have to do. And one of those stages is eventually getting the group of people together, internal buy-in, and discussing that with people of like, is it needed? And if it is needed, how do we do that? And what tools and things are we using right now that are working that we don't want to change? And what's not working that maybe we need to think about replacing? You know, there are a lot of small things and very cost-effective things that any company can do to start employer branding. Just little things like, adding a little more information or even a person's name to a job description, something like that. Like, this is the person who actually does this job, contact them on LinkedIn or something like that, right? There's just so many small things that companies could do that they're not really thinking to do. So we hopefully help companies help develop those types of content for their organization.